Good to be here today. We're going to go over some basic turf. I do have a handout out in the hallway as you go in and out. So I brought about 100 copies. And what? There's 125 or so here today, it looks like. So if you're with a company, if you can just take one copy, that'd be super. We're just going to go over some of the basics. You recognize any of these people? John Sorokin, maybe. We have a big turf grass field day in Knoxville every year. This year it's going to be on September 12th. If you haven't been to that, you need to go. Jim Brosnan will be there, of course. And it's not only turf grass, but also ornamentals. So Dr. Wyndham and I will probably talk on ornamentals, possibly turf grass. So try to check that out. Some of our turf pests, are these the big bad turf pests you see every year? White grubs is probably number one. Cutworms, things like that. How about bill bugs? Do you have any zoysia grass where you have bill bug problems maybe? Bermuda. Of course, imported fire ants are becoming more of a problem. So we're going to cover some of these today. You're not probably used to seeing white grubs on the grass surface like that, are you? Where do the white grubs usually stay? They're feeding in the root zone, aren't they? Below the surface. If you dig them up and toss them on the grass, that's what they'll look like. But there is one, a green June beetle, that will actually come out at night and wiggle on its back right through the grass. But for the most part, you're going to find them underground. And they can do a lot of damage. You can see all of our scarab-type beetles, May beetle, green June beetle, and the corresponding larvae, which we call white grubs. And white grubs have legs, they have a head with chewing mouth parts, and the damage they do is right on the roots of the plant. So if they feed and trim off those roots, what's going to happen to the plant? It's going to dry up and desiccate and die. So they have that potential to kill out patches of turf grass. I wanted to show you one here, Japanese beetle, and another, this is the oriental beetle. And this little guy right here, you know what that is? If you ever have a golf course, you might see the black turf grass antennae. So all those adults across the top, that's as big as they get. So there's a big difference between a black turf grass antennae and a green June beetle in there. The grubs also, this is as big as the grub's going to get. So there's a big, I don't know how many fold difference there. Would you think it'd be easier to kill, just with an insecticide in general, would it be easier to kill this one or this one? Probably, with the way insecticides work, the bigger they are, they have more volume. And that more volume allows them to have fat bodies and other ways to break down insecticides. So in general, smaller insects or more immature insects, let's say the first stage that hatches from the egg, is going to be easier to kill than this third instar grub here that's molded a couple times. So that's why we really want to control them early. As far as life cycle, let's just talk about a 1-year life cycle, something like a Japanese beetle. Okay, it's going to be out in the summertime, June, July. It'll be mating and laying those eggs. Japanese beetles are attracted to nice, lush, green, damp turf situation. Irrigated turf, let's say. Usually in July in Tennessee, West Tennessee, it tends to get a little dry, doesn't it? So the white grubs the populations don't tend to be as high in these real dry turf grass, like an unirrigated backyard, as opposed to a golf course or someplace where they irrigate regularly. So the egg will hatch in, let's say late July. It's going to molt then probably in August to a second instar, sometime in August, maybe September, October, and mold into a third instar. And that's all the larval stages it's going to have. Then it spends the winter as a third instar larva. In the spring, then it pupates into, it becomes a pupa. And from that pupa is where it transforms from a larva, white grub, into those beetles we saw. Okay, now that stage, is that a good stage to go after as far as insecticides, the pupal stage? What do you think? Yes, no? It's probably not very good because of this one reason. The pupa isn't feeding. It's a stage where it's developing, transforming. So they're not eating insecticides, they're not moving around. it's probably a tough stage to control. So we really want to control those larval stages, preferably in the summer while they're small, not in the spring where it's a full size grub like that, okay? So maybe when that grub started out, it was more like that size. See what I mean? Real small, easier to kill. Oriental beetle, we've seen those in East Tennessee. Also saw them in Nashville. I've caught them in traps. So they get moved around probably in ornamental grasses. Probably the May or June beetles are the ones that are going to give us the most trouble as far as damage. And since they have at least, it takes them, most of these are, 1-year life cycle, or the black turf crassitenius will have 2 generations in a year. May beetles up north, it might be 1 generation every 3 years or 4 years. Here in Tennessee, I think it's 1 every 2 years. So you can go out in middle of the summer and you might see a pretty good sized white grub next to a little tiny one that just hatched from an egg. The one that's bigger is probably a May beetle that's a year old. So it's going to be bigger, a little tougher to control. And that's what I'm talking about when we're digging. We do a square foot cut in the turf. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a good number of white grubs there. A typical backyard situation where you probably only have mash shapers, which is a type of beetle, might only have 1 or 2 grubs per square foot. And a typical backyard in Tennessee, where you don't irrigate a lot, you'll never probably have to even treat for white grubs because there's not enough to really do any damage. But what we want to do, this is, when are we doing this? In the middle of the summer, July, early, mid-July, and we're trying to determine how many grubs per square foot. Just look at those squares below your feet. That's what we're talking about. Cut 3 sides of that out. Do that several times in a yard, average it out, and see how many white grubs you have. In general, when we talk about doing this, we're going to apply a curative insecticide if we reach our thresholds where we need to treat. Curative means you count, you see how many insects you have. If you have enough of them, then you apply an insecticide to kill it. Insect management is a little easier than disease management because Dr. Wyndham will tell you that diseases, for the most part, we have to put a preventative, some kind of a fungicide on the plant so it doesn't get a disease. After it gets the disease, it's kind of harder to control. But with insecticides, we can wait and see if we have insects in high enough populations to treat. The old standby we've used in the past is Dilox. We still have that. We used to have a product called Diazinon that we use in the landscapes, but we can't use that anymore. Diazinon and Dursman we can't use those in a backyard situation. But we do have Dilox or trichlorophon, and a new product called Aceleprone. I'm going to talk quite a bit on that. It's a new product by, I believe, DuPont, and it's a very interesting insecticide. It has a lot of uses. So the first, second, third instar grubs, we want to use this in the summertime, preferably early. Why do we do this sampling for, we call them economic thresholds, and on turfgrass we often call them aesthetic thresholds, because we want to be able to determine when we need to treat, but we don't want to treat if we don't need to treat, okay? So it's very important to have a good confidence in whatever your decisions are as a turfgrass manager. When we're talking about integrated pest management, one component of it is what? Scouting. That's what we're doing. When we monitor or make those cuts in the ground and count the number of grubs, we're doing scouting. So we can tell people, well, yeah, we're doing it the right way. We are the original green industry. You know that? You hear everything about green, all these projects that tend to fail, but we are the ones that are successful in the green industry, aren't we? We've been out there for a long time and taking care of plants and doing a good job. And so we don't want to overuse pesticides. We just want to use them as needed. Here's what we're talking about, these aesthetic thresholds. And I'm going to show you some slides after this so you can tell you can figure out how to tell some of these type grub species apart. But the annual white grubs means 1 generation a year. Good examples, Japanese beetle, and we have a threshold of 5 to 10 grubs. It's not static, it's more dynamic. Let's say if you have a situation where your client is very picky, they don't want any grub damage at all, you might use that 5. If you have a Bermuda grass lawn, it's pretty actively growing, and you're not as picky a customer, you might even raise it up to 10. You know, you can vary these things for your situation. Mass Schaefer's, why 15 to 20, do you think? This type of white grub feeds not only on live roots, but also on dead organic matter. So it's going to take more of them to do the same amount of damage as a similar size Japanese beetle. The black turf grass Atenius, what do we know about it? How big is it? Not very big at all, is it? They're very tiny. It's going to take a lot more of those to do the same amount of feeding damage. And this is, how do they figure this out? Graduate students. You know, graduate students are, gosh, they just work, and they go do all these tests and just determine how much tissue they eat and document it. So we can base that on that. Mayor June beetle is probably the most damaging. Their lowest threshold, 3 to 8. And they have potential, because you'll have some bigger ones too. And green June beetles, 6 to 8. That's pretty good. The one thing the green June beetle does, often it doesn't just devour roots, but also it digs and kind of churns through the soil, and the soil and the roots will be separated and tend to desiccate. So a lot of that is just because they churn up the soil. Now, where are you going to find a lot of green June beetles? Places where you have a lot of high organic matter. It could be in mulch beds. It could be in pastures. Let's say a pasture where you have cattle. You have a lot of manure, a lot of organic matter. Sometimes you'll have bad infestations there of green June beetles. And we can often spray those in that situation with an insecticide like 7, because they come out at night and just spray in the late afternoon, and often they'll come into contact with it. Here's a little black turf grass Atenius. You can see a pretty high population. I hope you don't ever see that many Japanese beetles in a square foot. That's a pretty good population in. But they'll count those up, and if it's in that 30 to 40 or 50 range, they might do some treatment. But generally, you're only going to see this on a golf course. That's as big as the beetle gets. That's about as big as the larvae gets. Okay? What about this damage right here? You see in a golf course situation, you'll get little patches of dead turf grass where the roots have been severed. Okay? And it's going to be more damaging, of course, on something like a green or close to an apron of a green, something like that. You really want to watch that. Now, the second type of control is called preventative. We talked about curative. Preventative means that you're actually going to apply insecticide, okay, prior to even the hatching of the eggs. Now, how are we going to know if our threshold's been exceeded or not? We really don't know. We can only go from past history. Let's say in the past few years you have had a problem with white grubs every year. And you said, I'm not going to do a curative this year. I want to manage my time a little better. I'm going to get out early in front of it. I'm going to apply a product like Merit. I'm going to put it down. Do I say best time mid-June to mid-July? So you're sort of prior to even egg lay or when the eggs hatch. So that insecticide is in the ground. When that egg first hatches, that first instar white grub does what? Starts feeding on that root. It gets a toxic dose. The imidacloprid is actually absorbed by the roots in this case. Not all these will do that. So you have products like Merit, which has imidacloprid, that's systemic neonicotinoid insecticide. Electus, which has both a pyrethroid insecticide, I believe it's bifenthrin, plus imidacloprid. And then Mach 2 is another type of insecticide. Meridian is the same neonicotinoid as a Merit and Electus. The new acelloprin that we also could use as a curative can be used because it's very long lasting. These insecticides tend to be more persistent in the soil. Aloft is another neonicotinoid combination product, has clothianidin in it, and Arena is just clothianidin by itself. So these ones here, this one, Merit and Electus, all have neonicotinoid class of insecticides. It's probably the newest and the most commonly used insecticides in the world today. Acetylprin, let's talk about it. It's a new mode of action, a new type insecticide. It's basically labeled for all kinds of turfgrass uses, whether it's golf course, sod farms, residential. So you can use it about anywhere you have turfgrass. Is both a preventative and a curative on the white grubs. We just went over that, okay? Also, this is an important thing. When we use something like merit or imidacloprid for white grubs, we're really not going to get control of cutworms, let's say, or armyworms. But this product, acetylprin, is very active. It's really extremely active on caterpillars and also billbugs. So sod webworm caterpillars, cutworms, armyworms, fall armyworms. You apply this for white grubs, at the rate for white grubs, you're going to basically get season-long control on your caterpillars too. So that's giving you, it's going to be more expensive. It's not for everybody. It's going to be in these high commercial turfgrass areas, maybe golf courses, things like that. But it gives you an advantage in that you're not having to go back all the time with spraying for cutworms. You'll probably get 3 months control or so. Let's look at green June beetles just to show you what the adult looks like, and then the larva. The larva this is the raster. So when I look at a white grub under a microscope or a hand lens, and I'm trying to determine which one it is, well, the green June beetle tends to be more straight, not as C-shaped as the others. It's bigger. But we also look at the raster, and there's sort of like a number 1 there. Let's see if I have another picture of it. Yeah. Looks like number 1, these little short brown hairs called seta, and these seta make just like a number 1. So the first one we're going to talk about is the green June beetle. You can see that with the naked eye. You don't even need a hand lens. So you can tell right off the bat, do I have green June beetles or what? And there's the chewing mouth parts and the 6 legs. A typical May or June beetle, some come out, up north they might come out in May and June, but they're out even earlier here in Tennessee, aren't they? But you can see the beetles, the scarab beetles, look at the antennae, lamellate antenna, they're kind of neat. And let's look what the larvae look like. I call this one, looks like a zipper, slightly open zipper or 11. Okay, you can see two lines there, parallel lines. The little cedar, the little raster. You see what I'm looking at right here? There's one line, and there's the other, parallel. In some species, depending on the species of May beetle, it might open and curve out a little bit. It's not always parallel, it might curve slightly. But that you can tell, I think you can tell that between the first 2, can't you? It's close, but you can determine those, I think. Now the masked shapers have a black mask, like the Lone Ranger on their face. Of course, they're going to mate in the grass, and the female will then do what? She'll dig into the soil to lay her eggs. What's that look like? Do you see a 1 or an 11 or anything? No, I don't really see that. It's more evenly, I just say it doesn't have a raster pattern. The little cedar hairs are more just evenly distributed. Looks like somebody with a little stubble on their chin, okay? That's the masked shaper. And really, in dry situations, that might be the predominant white grub you see. In my yard, I live in Williamson County in Franklin, and in my backyard, I always had predominantly masked shapers. Remember, it was 15 or 20 per square foot, and I would catch I'd find when I sampled 1 or 2. So after a few years of that, I don't even sample anymore. I never treated. I lived there 19 years. Never treated once for white grubs. Okay, so that's typical. Japanese beetles have moved pretty much across the state. 20 years ago when I moved to Tennessee, Japanese beetles were more in East Tennessee. They're real common there. I think it was 2007 when we had that Easter freeze. Remember that? And it was a drought year. Well, we had pretty good populations the year before, 2006, in Nashville area. That was the biggest year we had for Japanese beetles. They just sort of moved in that area. People didn't know that they defoliated the skeletonized leaves on linden trees. And they got caught, they didn't really know what to do. Before they knew it, they had a lot of defoliation. Well, that drought year, 2007, the next year, really knocked back the Japanese beetle populations. So that really it's 2013 now, and they're just starting to get back where they were in 2006, 6 or 7 years ago. So it really knocked them back. I think it was so dry, the ground was so dry, I don't think the Japanese beetles could even get out of the ground. They pupated in the soil. I don't know if they even got out. There weren't very many of them. The Japanese beetle raster, you can see here on actual specimens, a V-shaped. See the V? Okay, victory over Japan. My dad was in the South Pacific. And he would be 96 years old if he was alive today. So to all the veterans out there. But you can see there the Japanese beetle, and they can do quite a bit of damage. But they're going to attack the more lush green areas. You might find when you sample that in low areas where it's a little more moisture, you're going to have higher populations of white grubs from Japanese beetles. Up on the hills, drier areas, it's going to have lower populations. Another thing, let's talk about caterpillars now. Okay, these guys can actually fly quite a distance. The black cutworm in general doesn't overwinter. Not many of these overwinter in Tennessee. I expect some in Memphis area, possibly south of here, could overwinter. But for the most part, the populations of these moths overwinter in the Gulf Coast states. Then what happens? What kind of spring rains do we have? Where's that rain, that front come from? Gulf moisture, doesn't it? It's driven up. I put a pheromone trap, a trap for the moths, and I put it out in Nashville. The same day I was catching these moths, and I think it was in April one year, they were catching them in Illinois. Okay, so a big storm front came through. The moths just fly up in the clouds. They come down, lay their eggs around corn. That's why they're interested in the things in Tennessee, Illinois, primarily is corn crops, because they will clip off the corns, plants. So you can see it's a big, robust, kind of fat and sassy caterpillar. And they're going to be nocturnal feeders. They're going to live under clods of dirt in the daytime, come out at night and clip on plants. You can see here they can also feed on turf grass. They'll get down in the thatch and come out and feed around the base. So you can see a black cutworm larva there. And these larvae at night will not only move, they'll move some distance. So let's say you sprayed a golf course green and you just sprayed the green. They could be some out 10, 15 yards out from the green, and they can move into that green during night. So I always say if you're going to spray a green to protect it, spray a boom or two out from the green. Then you can control some of those black cutworms that might be immigrating into it. Now, how do we sample for these guys? One thing we do is going to be different than we do for white grubs. We're just going to get soapy water. Get some dishwashing soap, squeeze a couple teaspoons in there in a gallon or so of water. You might use 2 gallons depending on how dry the soil is. Get some soapy water, pour it in look at your feet there. 4 of those squares, 2 foot by 2 foot, 4 square feet. Pour the soil down. I like to make a little frame. You're going to have, it's going to, you know, if you've heard of insecticidal soap, this soap will actually kill the insects. It irritates them, forces them to the top. Do you think it's going to get the white grub larvae? Probably not. They're going to stay in the soil. But things that are feeding on the leaves, in the thatch, like bill bugs, maybe black turfgrass attenius adult might be in there, might be forced to the top. You know, your caterpillars. And there's Dr. Klingman in Knoxville. That's at the research farm there. We have a turfgrass field day. And he's pouring that soapy solution right into the grass, and we're going to watch that and see what comes up. Now for cutworms, the threshold is very low. On average, if you have 1 per 4 square foot, you better treat, because you have a nice green, imagine a nice green turfgrass area, highly manicured, and you have every 6 or so feet, you have a yellow spot where the black cutworms devour the crown of the plant, where they're down in their burrow. And so it doesn't take very many of those to make it look like something's wrong. You can see these black cutworms are full size, 5th inch star. There's the pupa. You know, not all moths and butterflies and such. Some moths will have cocoons, silken cocoons around the pupa, but this one doesn't. Most of your butterflies don't. Sometimes with black cutworms, if it's real dry, you want to pre-irrigate before you put your insecticide down there. Okay, so wet the thatch a little bit. Of course, we talked about that they can move around. What's this guy? You ever see these? Yes. Yeah, army worms. Now, guys, every year I get calls and somebody says, man, those army worms just took out a whole pasture. They did some damage, a lot of damage. Guess what? Do you think it's the little first instar caterpillars doing all that damage, or is that fifth instar big one? What do you think? Fifth or sixth instar? It's the big ones, isn't it? So if you guys are actually getting in the habit of using some soap disclosing solution, and just do that periodically, every week or two, somewhere, one or two places, you will actually detect army worms when they're still tiny. When they hatch, these army worms the army worm moth will lay an egg mass, where the black cutworm lays individual eggs on the sheets of the grass. Army worms will lay an egg mass that have 100 or more eggs. So you can have literally thousands of these little caterpillars coming up in a big area, okay? So you can detect them early, get your control spray there, control them before they do any damage at all. And that's the key. That's why you want to do this. You don't want them to do the damage. So they're easier to kill, easier to control when they're tiny. The fall armyworm is another armyworm you might see. The way I tell them apart, this one tends to be maybe a little darker, more olive green, but they vary in color. But look at the head. It tends to be a darker head, not as orangish as the armyworm. And also you see this white upside down Y, inverted Y. That's the sutures in the head capsule. And that upside down Y, if you look at it straight on with the hand lens, you can tell that's a fall armyworm. It really shows up in the fall armyworm. And there's the pupa. It's in the thatch there. So these are big size maturing larvae here. And there's that egg mass as I was telling you about. Fall armyworms and armyworms, they'll lay egg mass. In the case of the fall armyworm, they'll lay that egg mass on a fence, on the side of the house, on a little, bicycle, anything that's laying out there, okay? Little flags and things you might have around sports fields, they'll lay their eggs on those. Why do you think that there's damage here next to the house and not over here? Yeah, light pole. Yeah, the moths are also attracted to light. So they're going to come to the light. Whoa, that's a good hit, wasn't it? They'll come to the light, and then they're going to find something to lay, some kind of structure to lay those egg masses on. And so the initial damage is moving out from the house to the rest of the yard. Okay? How am I doing on time? A minute? That doesn't give me a long time, does it? Okay. I've got more than enough stuff you'll have to read up on. I want to show you one thing here, if I can. This is interesting. This is a new invasive pest. It's not going to be a problem. We found this in Wilson County. It's a little Bermuda grass stem borer. This isn't in your handout. I just put this in a few minutes ago. But this little maggot will feed on the top layers of, the top leaf, and you'll get this little wilted look to the leaves. In a pasture, it's not going to be a turf grass problem, but in pastures, it'll look like it's been frosted, lightly frost hit. It's an invasive pest, and we have it in Tennessee now. So if you notice something like that, and it's real hot out, and it didn't frost, it might be this pest. So look for that. There's always something new. And thank you, and be sure to grab a handout because I had some other material I wanted to cover too. Thank you very much.